Hello, hello. Hello. I'm glad you're here. Thank you. Who's here today? I'm looking for the book, the chapters to play. There it is. So I volunteered at a canoe race today. That was fun. I just go help out with registration, give people their numbers. So I'm still working on Maisie. I pretty much just work on her on the live and sometimes a little bit after. It is hard to do while I'm listening to the story because I have to pay attention to the numbers to count where I am. So we've got a lot of participants in the Facebook group. There are people showing their progress in our Facebook group and not necessarily hanging out with the lives. And that's okay too. And people come and listen to the book when they can, if now is not a good time. If now is not a good time for them to hang out with us. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Let's see. All right, A Room with a View, chapters 10, 11, and 12. Oh, somebody was just here.
Chapter 10. Cecil as a Humorist. The society out of which Cecil proposed to rescue Lucy was perhaps no very splendid affair, yet it was more splendid than her antecedents entitled her to. Her father, a prosperous local solicitor, had built Windy Corner as a speculation at the time the district was opening up, and, falling in love with his own creation, had ended by living there himself. Soon after his marriage, the social atmosphere began to alter. Other houses were built on the brow of that steep southern slope, and others, again, among the pine trees behind, and northward on the chalk barrier of the downs. Most of these houses were larger than Windy Corner, and were filled by people who came, not from the district, but from London, and who mistook the Honeychurches for the remnants of an indigenous aristocracy. He was inclined to be frightened, but his wife accepted the situation without either pride or humility.
"I cannot think what people are doing,"
she would say,
"but it is extremely fortunate for the children."
She called everywhere. Her calls were returned with enthusiasm, and by the time people found out that she was not exactly of their milieu, they liked her, and it did not seem to matter. When Mr. Honeychurch died, he had the satisfaction, which few honest solicitors despise, of leaving his family rooted in the best society obtainable. The best obtainable. Certainly many of the immigrants were rather dull, and Lucy realized this more vividly since her return from Italy. Hitherto she had accepted their ideals without questioning, their kindly affluence, their inexplosive religion, their dislike of paper bags, orange peel, and broken bottles. A radical out and out, she learnt to speak with horror of suburbia. Life, so far as she troubled to conceive it, was a circle of rich, pleasant people, with identical interests and identical foes. In this circle one thought, married, and died. Outside it were poverty and vulgarity forever trying to enter, just as the London fog tries to enter the pine woods pouring through the gaps in the northern hills. But in Italy, where anyone who chooses may warm himself in equality, as in the sun, this conception of life vanished. Her senses expanded. She felt that there was no one whom she might not get to like, that social barriers were irremovable, doubtless, but not particularly high. You jump over them just as you jump into a peasant's olive yard in the Apennines, and he is glad to see you. She returned with new eyes. So did Cecil, but Italy had quickened Cecil, not to tolerance, but to irritation. He saw that the local society was narrow, but instead of saying, "Does that very much matter?" he rebelled, and tried to substitute for it the society he called broad. He did not realize that Lucy had consecrated her environment by the thousand little civilities that create a tenderness in time, and that though her eyes saw its defects, her heart refused to despise it entirely. Nor did he realize a more important point, that if she was too great for this society, she was too great for all society, and had reached the stage where personal intercourse would alone satisfy her. A rebel she was, but not of the kind he understood, a rebel who desired not a wider dwelling room, but equality beside the man she loved. For Italy was offering her the most priceless of all possessions, her own soul. Playing bumble puppy with Minnie Beebe, niece to the rector and aged 13, an ancient and most honorable game, which consists in striking tennis balls high into the air, so that they fall over the net and immoderately bounce. Some hit Mrs. Honeychurch, others are lost. The sentence is confused, but the better illustrates Lucy's state of mind, for she was trying to talk to Mr. Beebe at the same time. Oh, it has been such a nuisance. First he, then they, no one knowing what they wanted, and everyone so tiresome.
But they are really coming now,
said Mr. Beebe.
I wrote to Miss Teresa a few days ago. She was wondering how often the butcher called, and my reply of once a month must have impressed her favorably. They are coming. I heard from them this morning.
I shall hate those Miss Allens.
Mrs. Honeychurch cried.
Just because they're old and silly, one's expected to say how sweet. I hate their ifing, and butting, and anding. And poor Lucy, serve her right, worn to a shadow.
Mr. Beebe watched the shadows springing and shouting over the tennis court. Cecil was absent. One did not play bumble puppy when he was there. Well, if they are coming. No, Minnie, not Saturn. Saturn was a tennis ball whose skin was partially unsewn. When in motion, his orb was encircled by a ring. If they are coming, Sir Harry will let them move in before the 29th, and he will cross out the clause about whitewashing the ceilings, because it made them nervous, and put in the fair wear and tear one. That doesn't count, I told you, not Saturn.
Saturn's all right for bumble puppy,
cried Freddie, joining them.
Minnie, don't you listen to her.
Saturn doesn't bounce.
Saturn bounces enough.
No, he doesn't.
Well, he bounces better than the beautiful white devil.
Hush, dear,
said Mrs. Honeychurch.
But look at Lucy, complaining of Saturn and all the time's got the beautiful white devil in her hand, ready to plug it in. That's right, Minnie, go for her. Get her over the shins with the racket. Get her over the shins.
Lucy fell. The beautiful white devil rolled from her hand. Mr. Beebe picked it up and said,
The name of this ball is Vittoria Corombona, please.
But his correction passed unheeded. Freddie possessed, to a high degree, the power of lashing little girls to fury, and in half a minute he had transformed Minnie from a well-mannered child into a howling wilderness. Up in the house, Cecil heard them, and though he was full of entertaining news, he did not come down to impart it, in case he got hurt. He was not a coward, and bore necessary pain as well as any man. but he hated the physical violence of the young. How right it was. Sure enough, it ended in a cry.
I wish the Miss Allens could see this,
Observed Mr. Beebe, just as Lucy, who was nursing the injured Minnie, was in turn lifted off her feet by her brother.
Who are the Miss Allens?
Freddie panted. They have taken Sissy Villa.
That wasn't the name.
Here his foot slipped, and they all fell most agreeably onto the grass. An interval elapses. Wasn't what name? Asked Lucy, with her brother's head in her lap.
Allen wasn't the name of the people Sir Harry's led to.
Nonsense, Freddie, you know nothing about it.
Nonsense yourself. I've this minute seen him. He said to me, "Ahem, Honeychurch."
Freddie was an indifferent mimic.
Ahem, I have at last procured really desirable tenants. I said, "Hooray, old boy," and slapped him on the back.
Exactly. The Miss Allens.
Rather not. More like Anderson.
Oh, good gracious. There isn't going to be another muddle.
Mrs. Honeychurch exclaimed.
Do you notice, Lucy? I'm always right. I said don't interfere with Sissy Villa. I'm always right. I'm quite uneasy at being always right so often.
It's only another muddle of Freddie's. Freddie doesn't even know the name of the people he pretends have taken it instead.
Yes, I do. I've got it. Emerson.
What name?
Emerson. I'll bet you anything you like.
What a weathercock Sir Harry is, said Lucy quietly. I wish I had never bothered over it at all. Then she lay on her back and gazed at the cloudless sky. Mr. Beebe, whose opinion of her rose daily, whispered to his niece that was the proper way to behave if any little thing went wrong. Meanwhile, the name of the new tenants had diverted Mrs. Honeychurch from the contemplation of her own abilities.
Emerson, Freddie, do you know what Emersons they are?
I don't know whether there are any Emersons,
retorted Freddie, who was democratic. Like his sister and like most young people, he was naturally attracted by the idea of equality, and the undeniable fact that there are different kinds of Emersons annoyed him beyond measure.
I trust they are the right sort of people. All right, Lucy.
She was sitting up again.
I see you looking down your nose and thinking your mother's a snob. But there is a right sort and a wrong sort, and it's affectation to pretend there isn't.
Emerson's a common enough name, Lucy remarked. She was gazing sideways. Seated on a promontory herself, she could see the pine-clad promontories descending one beyond another into the wold. The further one descended the garden, the more glorious was this lateral view.
I was merely going to remark, Freddie, that I trusted they were no relations of Emerson the philosopher, a most trying man. Pray, does that satisfy you?
Oh, yes.
He grumbled.
And you'll be satisfied too, for they're friends of Cecil, so...
Elaborate irony.
You and the other country families will be able to call in perfect safety.
Cecil? Exclaimed Lucy.
Don't be rude, dear,
said his mother placidly.
Lucy, don't screech. It's a bad new habit you're getting into.
But has Cecil?
Friends of Cecil's,
he repeated.
And so really desirable. Ahem, Honeychurch, I have just telegraphed to them.
She got up from the grass. It was hard on Lucy. Mr. Beebe sympathized with her very much. While she believed that her snub about the Miss Allens came from Sir Harry Otway, she had borne it like a good girl. She might well screech when she heard that it came partly from her lover. Mr. Vyse was a tease, something worse than a tease. He took a malicious pleasure in thwarting people. The clergyman, knowing this, looked at Miss Honeychurch with more than his usual kindness. When she exclaimed, "But Cecil's Emersons, they can't possibly be the same ones. There is that—" He did not consider that the exclamation was strange, but saw in it an opportunity of diverting the conversation while she recovered her composure. He diverted it as follows.
The Emersons who were at Florence, you mean? No, I don't suppose it will prove to be them. It is probably a long cry from them to friends of Mr. Vyse's. Oh, Mrs. Honeychurch, the oddest people, the queerest people. For our part, we liked them, didn't we?
He appealed to Lucy.
There was a great scene over some violets. They picked violets and filled all the vases in the room of these very Miss Allens who have failed to come to Sissy Villa. Poor little ladies, so shocked and so pleased. It used to be one of Miss Catherine's great stories. My dear sister loves flowers, it began. They found the whole room a mass of blue, vases and jugs, and the story ends with, so ungentlemanly and yet so beautiful. It was all very difficult. Yes, I always connect those Florentine Emersons with violets.
Fiasco's done you this time,
remarked Freddie, not seeing that his sister's face was very red. She could not recover herself. Mr. Beebe saw it and continued to divert the conversation.
These particular Emersons consisted of a father and a son. The son a goodly, if not a good young man. Not a fool, I fancy, but very immature, pessimism, etc. Our special joy was the father, such a sentimental darling, and people declared he had murdered his wife.
In his normal state, Mr. Beebe would never have repeated such gossip, but he was trying to shelter Lucy in her little trouble. He repeated any rubbish that came into his head.
Murdered his wife,
said Mrs. Honeychurch.
Lucy, don't desert us. Go on playing Bumble Puppy. Really, the Pension Bertioli must have been the oddest place. That's the second murderer I've heard of as being there. Whatever was Charlotte doing to stop? By the by, we really must ask Charlotte here sometime.
Mr. Beebe could recall no second murderer. He suggested that his hostess was mistaken. At the hint of opposition, she warmed. She was perfectly sure that there had been a second tourist of whom the same story had been told. The name escaped her. What was the name? Oh, what was the name? She clasped her knees for the name. Something in Thackeray. She struck her matronly forehead. Lucy asked her brother whether Cecil was in.
Oh, don't go,
he cried, and tried to catch her by the ankles. I must go, she said gravely. Don't be silly. You always overdo it when you play. As she left them, her mother's shout of, Harris, shivered the tranquil air, and reminded her that she had told a lie and had never put it right. Such a senseless lie, too, yet it shattered her nerves and made her connect these Emersons, friends of Cecil's, with a pair of nondescript tourists. Hitherto, truth had come to her naturally. She saw that for the future she must be more vigilant and be absolutely truthful. Well, at all events, she must not tell lies. She hurried up the garden, still flushed with shame. A word from Cecil would soothe her, she was sure. Cecil!
Hello,
he called, and leant out of the smoking-room window. He seemed in high spirits.
I was hoping you'd come. I heard you all bear gardening, but there's better fun up here. Even I, have won a great victory for the comic muse. George Meredith's right. The cause of comedy and the cause of truth are really the same. And even I, have found tenants for the distressful Villa. Don't be angry. Don't be angry. You'll forgive me when you hear it all.
He looked very attractive when his face was bright, and he dispelled her ridiculous forebodings at once. I have heard, she said. Freddie has told us. Naughty Cecil. I suppose I must forgive you. Just think of all the trouble I took for nothing. Certainly the Miss Allens are a little tiresome, and I'd rather have nice friends of yours. But you oughtn't to tease one so.
Friends of mine?
He laughed.
But Lucy, the whole joke is to come. Come here.
But she remained standing where she was.
Do you know where I met these desirable tenants? In the National Gallery, when I was up to see my mother last week.
What an odd place to meet people, she said nervously. I don't quite understand.
In the Umbrian room, absolute strangers. They were admiring Luca Signorelli, of course, quite stupidly. However, we got talking, and they refreshed me not a little. They had been to Italy.
But Cecil proceeded hilariously.
In the course of conversation, they said that they wanted a country cottage. The father to live there, the son to run down for weekends. I thought, what a chance of scoring off Sir Harry. And I took their address and a London reference. Found they weren't actual blackguards. It was great sport. And wrote to him, making out.
Cecil, no, it's not fair. I've probably met them before. He bore her down.
Perfectly fair. Anything is fair that punishes a snob. That old man will do the neighborhood a world of good. Sir Harry is too disgusting with his decayed gentlewoman. I meant to read him a lesson sometime. No, Lucy, the classes ought to mix. And before long, you'll agree with me. There ought to be intermarriage. All sorts of things. I believe in democracy.
No, you don't, she snapped. You don't know what the word means. He stared at her and felt again that she had failed to be Leonard-esque. No, you don't. Her face was inartistic, that of a peevish virago. It isn't fair, Cecil. I blame you. I blame you very much indeed. You had no business to undo my work about the Miss Allens and make me look ridiculous. You call it scoring off Sir Harry, but do you realize that it is all at my expense? I consider it most disloyal of you. She left him.
Temper?
He thought, raising his eyebrows. No, it was worse than temper. Snobbishness. As long as Lucy thought that his own smart friends were supplanting the Miss Allens, she had not minded. He perceived that these new tenants might be of value educationally. He would tolerate the father and draw out the son, who was silent. In the interests of the comic muse and of truth, he would bring them to Windy Corner. Chapter 11. In Mrs. Vyse's well-appointed flat. The comic muse, though able to look after her own interests, did not disdain the assistance of Mr. Vyse. His idea of bringing the Emersons to Windy Corner struck her as decidedly good, and she carried through the negotiations without a hitch. Sir Harry Otway signed the agreement, met Mr. Emerson, who was duly disillusioned. The Miss Allens were duly offended, and wrote a dignified letter to Lucy, whom they held responsible for the failure. Mr. Beebe planned pleasant moments for the newcomers, and told Mrs. Honeychurch that Freddie must call on them as soon as they arrived. Indeed, so ample was the muse's equipment that she permitted Mr. Harris, never a very robust criminal, to droop his head, to be forgotten, and to die. Lucy, to descend from bright heaven to earth, whereon there are shadows because there are hills, Lucy was at first plunged into despair, but settled after a little thought that it did not matter the very least. Now that she was engaged, the Emersons would scarcely insult her, and were welcome into the neighborhood. And Cecil was welcome to bring whom he would into the neighborhood. Therefore, Cecil was welcome to bring the Emersons into the neighborhood. But, as I say, this took a little thinking, and, so illogical are girls, the event remained rather greater and rather more dreadful than it should have done. She was glad that a visit to Mrs. Vyse now fell due. The tenants moved into Sissy Villa while she was safe in the London flat. Cecil, darling, she whispered the evening she arrived, and crept into his arms. Cecil, too, became demonstrative. He saw that the needful fire had been kindled in Lucy. At last she longed for attention, as a woman should, and looked up to him because he was a man.
So you do love me, little thing.
He murmured. Oh, Cecil, I do. I don't know what I should do without you. Several days passed. Then she had a letter from Miss Bartlett. A coolness had sprung up between the two cousins, and they had not corresponded since they parted in August. The coolness dated from what Charlotte would call
the flight to Rome.
And in Rome it had increased amazingly. For the companion who is merely uncongenial in the medieval world becomes exasperating in the classical. Charlotte, unselfish in the forum, would have tried a sweeter temper than Lucy's, and once, in the baths of Caracalla, they had doubted whether they could continue their tour. Lucy had said she would join the Vyses. Mrs. Vyse was an acquaintance of her mother, so there was no impropriety in the plan, and Miss Bartlett had replied that she was quite used to being abandoned suddenly. Finally, nothing happened, but the coolness remained, and, for Lucy, was even increased when she opened the letter and read as follows. It had been forwarded from Windy Corner.
Tunbridge Wells, September. Dearest Lucia, I have news of you at last. Miss Lavish has been bicycling in your parts, but was not sure whether a call would be welcome. Puncturing her tyre near Summer Street, and it being mended while she sat very woebegone in that pretty churchyard, she saw to her astonishment a door open opposite, and the younger Emerson man come out. He said his father had just taken the house. He said he did not know that you lived in the neighbourhood. He never suggested giving Eleanor a cup of tea. Dear Lucy, I am much worried, and I advise you to make a clean breast of his past behaviour to your mother, Freddie, and Mr. Vyse, who will forbid him to enter the house, etc. That was a great misfortune, and I dare say you have told them already. Mr. Vyse is so sensitive. I remember how I used to get on his nerves at Rome. I am very sorry about it all, and should not feel easy unless I warned you. Believe me, your anxious and loving cousin, Charlotte.
Lucy was much annoyed and replied as follows. Beecham Mansions, SW. Dear Charlotte, many thanks for your warning. When Mr. Emerson forgot himself on the mountain, you made me promise not to tell Mother, because you said she would blame you for not being always with me. I have kept that promise, and cannot possibly tell her now. I have said both to her and to Cecil that I met the Emersons at Florence, and that they are respectable people, which I do think, and the reason that he offered Miss Lavish no tea was probably that he had none himself. She should have tried at the rectory. I cannot begin making a fuss at this stage. You must see that it would be too absurd. If the Emersons heard I had complained of them, they would think themselves of importance, which is exactly what they are not. I like the old father, and look forward to seeing him again. As for the son, I am sorry for him when we meet, rather than for myself. They are known to Cecil, who is very well and spoke of you the other day. We expect to be married in January. Miss Lavish cannot have told you much about me, for I am not at Windy Corner at all, but here. Please do not put private outside your envelope again. No one opens my letters. Yours affectionately, L. M. Honeychurch. Secrecy has this disadvantage. We lose the sense of proportion. We cannot tell whether our secret is important or not. Were Lucy and her cousin closeted with a great thing which would destroy Cecil's life if he discovered it, or with a little thing which he would laugh at? Miss Bartlett suggested the former. Perhaps she was right. It had become a great thing now. Left to herself, Lucy would have told her mother and her lover ingenuously, and it would have remained a little thing. Emerson, not Harris. It was only that a few weeks ago. She tried to tell Cecil even now, when they were laughing about some beautiful lady who had smitten his heart at school. But her body behaved so ridiculously that she stopped. She and her secret stayed 10 days longer in the deserted metropolis, visiting the scenes they were to know so well later on. It did her no harm, Cecil thought, to learn the framework of society, while society itself was absent on the golf links or the moors. The weather was cool, and it did her no harm. In spite of the season, Mrs. Vyse managed to scrape together a dinner party, consisting entirely of the grandchildren of famous people. The food was poor, but the talk had a witty weariness that impressed the girl. One was tired of everything, it seemed. One launched into enthusiasms only to collapse gracefully and pick oneself up amid sympathetic laughter. In this atmosphere, the Pension Bertolini and Windy Corner appeared equally crude, and Lucy saw that her London career would estrange her a little from all that she had loved in the past. The grandchildren asked her to play the piano. She played Schumann.
Now some Beethoven,
called Cecil, when the querulous beauty of the music had died. She shook her head and played Schumann again. The melody rose, unprofitably magical. It broke. It was resumed broken, not marching once from the cradle to the grave. The sadness of the incomplete, the sadness that is often life but should never be art, throbbed in its disjected phrases, and made the nerves of the audience throb. Not thus had she played on the little draped piano at the Bertolini, and too much Schumann was not the remark that Mr. Beebe had passed to himself when she returned. When the guests were gone, and Lucy had gone to bed, Mrs. Vyse paced up and down the drawing-room, discussing her little party with her son. Mrs. Vyse was a nice woman, but her personality, like many another's, had been swamped by London, for it needs a strong head to live among many people. The too vast orb of her fate had crushed her, and she had seen too many seasons, too many cities, too many men for her abilities, and even with Cecil she was mechanical, and behaved as if he was not one son, but, so to speak, a filial crowd.
Make Lucy one of us,
she said, looking round intelligently at the end of each sentence, and straining her lips apart until she spoke again.
Lucy's becoming wonderful. Wonderful.
Her music always was wonderful.
Yes, but she's purging off the Honeychurch tent. Most excellent Honeychurches. But you know what I mean? She's not always quoting servants or ask one how the pudding's made.
Italy has done it.
Perhaps.
she murmured, thinking of the museum that represented Italy to her.
It is just possible. Cecil, mind you marry her next January. She's one of us already.
But her music,
He exclaimed.
the style of her, how she kept to Schumann when, like an idiot, I wanted Beethoven. Schumann was right for this evening. Schumann was the thing. Do you know, Mother, I shall have our children educated just like Lucy. Bring them up among honest country folks for freshness. Send them to Italy for subtlety. And then, not till then, let them come to London. I don't believe in these London educations.
He broke off, remembering that he had had one himself, and concluded,
At all events, not for women.
Make her one of us.
repeated Mrs. Weiss, and processed to bed. As she was dozing off, a cry, the cry of nightmare, rang from Lucy's room. Lucy could ring for the maid if she liked, but Mrs. Weiss thought it kind to go herself. She found the girl sitting upright with her hand on her cheek. I am so sorry, Mrs. Weiss. It is these dreams.
Bad dreams.
Just dreams. The elder lady smiled and kissed her, saying very distinctly,
You should have heard us talking about you, dear. He admires you more than ever. Dream of that.
Lucy returned the kiss, still covering one cheek with her hand. Mrs. Weiss recessed to bed. Cecil, whom the cry had not awoke, snored. Darkness enveloped the flat. Chapter 12. It was a Saturday afternoon, gay and brilliant after abundant rains, and the spirit of youth dwelt in it, though the season was now autumn. All that was gracious triumphed. As the motor cars passed through Summer Street, they raised only a little dust, and their stench was soon dispersed by the wind and replaced by the scent of the wet birches or of the pines. Mr. Beebe, at leisure for life's amenities, leant over his rectory gate. Freddie leant by him, smoking a pendant pipe.
Suppose we go and hinder those new people opposite for a little.
Mm-hmm.
They might amuse you.
Freddie, whom his fellow creatures never amused, suggested that the new people might be feeling a bit busy, and so on, since they had only just moved in.
I suggested we should hinder them.
Said Mr. Beebe.
They are worth it.
Unlatching the gate, he sauntered over the triangular green to Sissy Villa.
Hello?
He cried, shouting in at the open door, through which much squalor was visible. A grave voice replied,
Hello?
I've brought someone to see you.
I'll be down in a minute.
The passage was blocked by a wardrobe, which the removal men had failed to carry up the stairs. Mr. Beebe edged round it with difficulty. The sitting room itself was blocked with books.
Are these people great readers?
Freddie whispered.
Are they that sort?
I fancy they know how to read, a rare accomplishment. But what have they got? Byron, exactly. A Shropshire lad, never heard of it. The Way of All Flesh, never heard of it. Gibbon. Hello, dear George reads German. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and so we go on. Well, I suppose your generation knows its own business, Honeychurch.
Mr. Beebe, look at that.
Said Freddie in awestruck tones. On the cornice of the wardrobe, the hand of an amateur had painted this inscription: Mistrust all enterprises that require new clothes.
I know. Isn't it jolly? I like that. I'm certain that's the old man's doing.
How very odd of him.
Surely you agree.
But Freddie was his mother's son, and felt that one ought not to go on spoiling the furniture.
Pictures.
The clergyman continued, scrambling about the room.
Giotto. They got that at Florence, I'll be bound.
The same as Lucy's got.
Oh, by the by, did Miss Honeychurch enjoy London?
She came back yesterday.
I suppose she had a good time.
Yes, very.
Said Freddie, taking up a book.
She and Cecil are thicker than ever.
That's good hearing.
I wish I wasn't such a fool, Mr. Beebe.
Mr. Beebe ignored the remark.
Lucy used to be nearly as stupid as I am, but it'll be very different now, Mother thinks. She will read all kinds of books.
So will you.
Only medical books, not books that you can talk about afterwards. Cecil is teaching Lucy Italian, and she says her playing is wonderful. There are all kinds of things in it that we have never noticed. Cecil says,
"What on earth are those people doing upstairs? Emerson, we think we'll come another time."
George ran downstairs and pushed them into the room without speaking.
Let me introduce Mr. Honeychurch, a neighbor.
Then Freddie hurled one of the thunderbolts of youth. Perhaps he was shy, perhaps he was friendly, or perhaps he thought that George's face wanted washing. At all events, he greeted him with,
"How do you do? Come and have a bathe."
Oh, all right.
said George, impassive. Mr. Beebe was highly entertained.
How do you do? How do you do? Come and have a bathe.
He chuckled.
That's the best conversational opening I have ever heard. But I'm afraid it will only act between men. Can you picture a lady who has been introduced to another lady by a third lady, opening civilities with, "How do you do? Come and have a bathe"? And yet, you will tell me that the sexes are equal.
I tell you that they shall be,
said Mr. Emerson, who had been slowly descending the stairs.
Good afternoon, Mr. Beebe. I tell you, they shall be comrades, and George thinks the same.
We are to raise ladies to our level,
the clergyman inquired.
The Garden of Eden,
pursued Mr. Emerson, still descending,
which you place in the past, is really yet to come. We shall enter it when we no longer despise our bodies.
Mr. Beebe disclaimed placing the Garden of Eden anywhere.
In this, not in other things, we men are ahead. We despise the body less than women do. But not until we are comrades shall we enter the garden.
I say, what about this bathe?
Murmured Freddie, appalled at the massive philosophy that was approaching him.
I believed in a return to nature once, but how can we return to nature when we have never been with her? Today, I believe that we must discover nature. After many conquests, we shall attain simplicity. It is our heritage.
Let me introduce Mr. Honeychurch, whose sister you will remember at Florence.
How do you do? Very glad to see you, and that you are taking George for a bathe. Very glad to hear that your sister is going to marry. Marriage is a duty. I'm sure that she will be happy, for we know Mr. Vyse too. He has been most kind. He met us by chance in the National Gallery and arranged everything about this delightful house, though I hope I have not vexed Sir Harry Otway. I have met so few liberal landowners, and I was anxious to compare his attitude towards the game laws with the conservative attitude. Ah, this wind! You do well to bathe. Yours is a glorious country, Honeychurch.
Not a bit,
mumbled Freddie.
I must, that is to say, I have to have the pleasure of calling on you later on, my mother says, I hope.
Call, my lad? Who taught us that drawing-room twaddle? Call on your grandmother? Listen to the wind among the pines. Yours is a glorious country.
Mr. Beebe came to the rescue.
Mr. Emerson, he will call, I shall call. You or your son will return our calls before 10 days have elapsed. I trust that you have realized about the 10 days interval. It does not count that I helped you with the stare eyes yesterday. It does not count that you are going to bathe this afternoon.
Yes. Go and bathe, George. Why do you dawdle talking? Bring them back to tea. Bring back some milk, cakes, honey. The change will do you good. George has been working very hard at his office. I can't believe he's well.
George bowed his head, dusty and somber, exhaling the peculiar smell of one who has handled furniture.
Do you really want this bathe?
Freddie asked him.
It is only a pond, don't you know? I dare say you are used to something better.
Yes, I have said yes already.
Mr. Beebe felt bound to assist his young friend, and led the way out of the house and into the pine woods. How glorious it was! For a little time the voice of old Mr. Emerson pursued them, dispensing good wishes and philosophy. It ceased, and they only heard the fair wind blowing the bracken in the trees. Mr. Beebe, who could be silent, but who could not bear silence, was compelled to chatter, since the expedition looked like a failure, and neither of his companions would utter a word. He spoke of Florence. George attended gravely, assenting or dissenting with slight but determined gestures that were as inexplicable as the motions of the treetops above their heads.
And what a coincidence that you should meet Mr. Weiss. Did you realize that you would find all the pension Bertolini down here?
I did not. Miss Lavish told me.
When I was a young man, I always meant to write a history of coincidence.
No enthusiasm.
Though, as a matter of fact, coincidences are much rarer than we suppose. For example, it isn't purely coincidentally that you are here now, when one comes to reflect.
To his relief, George began to talk.
It is. I have reflected. It is fate. Everything is fate. We are flung together by fate, drawn apart by fate, flung together, drawn apart. The 12 winds blow us. We settle nothing.
You have not reflected at all.
Rapped the clergyman.
Let me give you a useful tip, Emerson. Attribute nothing to fate. Don't say, I didn't do this, for you did it 10 to 1. Now I'll cross-question you. Where did you first meet Miss Honeychurch and myself?
Italy.
And where did you meet Mr. Weiss, who is going to marry Miss Honeychurch?
National Gallery.
Looking at Italian art. There you are, and yet you talk of coincidence and fate. You naturally seek out things Italian, and so do we and our friends. This narrows the field immeasurably. We meet again in it.
It is fate that I am here.
Persisted George.
But you can call it Italy, if it makes you less unhappy.
Mr. Beebe slid away from such heavy treatment of the subject, but he was infinitely tolerant of the young and had no desire to snub George.
And so, for this and for other reasons, my history of coincidence is still to write.
Silence. Wishing to round off the episode, he added,
We are all so glad that you have come.
Silence.
Here we are.
Called Freddie.
Oh, good.
Exclaimed Mr. Beebe, mopping his brow.
In there's the pond. I wish it was bigger.
He added apologetically. They climbed down a slippery bank of pine needles. There lay the pond, set in its little alp of green. Only a pond, but large enough to contain the human body, and pure enough to reflect the sky. On account of the rains, the waters had flooded the surrounding grass, which showed like a beautiful emerald path, tempting these feet towards the central pool.
It's distinctly successful as ponds go.
Said Mr. Beebe.
No apologies are necessary for the pond.
George sat down where the ground was dry, and drearily unlaced his boots.
Aren't those masses of willow herb splendid? I love willow herb in seed. What's the name of this aromatic plant?
No one knew or seemed to care.
These abrupt changes of vegetation, this little spongeous tract of water plants, and on either side of it all, the growths are tough or brittle. Heather, bracken, hurts, pines. Very charming, very charming.
Mr. Beebe, aren't you bathing?
Called Freddie as he stripped himself. Mr. Beebe thought he was not.
Water's wonderful.
Cried Freddie, prancing in.
Water's water.
Murmured George. Wetting his hair first, a sure sign of apathy, he followed Freddie into the divine, as indifferent as if he were a statue and the pond a pail of soapsuds. It was necessary to use his muscles. It was necessary to keep clean. Mr. Beebe watched them, and watched the seeds of the willow herb dance chorically above their heads. Went Freddie, swimming for 2 strokes in either direction, and then becoming involved in reeds or mud.
Is it worth it?
Asked the other, Michelangelesque on the flooded margin. The bank broke away, and he fell into the pool before he had weighed the question properly.
I saw the pollywog, Mr. B. Water's wonderful.
Gross.
Water's simply ripping.
Water's not so bad.
said George, reappearing from his plunge and sputtering at the sun.
Water's wonderful, Mr. Beebe. Do.
Mr. Beebe, who was hot, and who always acquiesced where possible, looked around him. He could detect no parishioners except the pine trees, rising up steeply on all sides, and gesturing to each other against the blue. How glorious it was! The world of motor cars and rural deans receded inimitably. Water, sky, evergreens, a wind, these things not even the seasons can touch, and surely they lie beyond the intrusion of man.
I may as well wash too.
And soon his garments made a third little pile on the sward, and he too asserted the wonder of the water. It was ordinary water, nor was there very much of it, and, as Freddie said, it reminded one of swimming in a salad. The three gentlemen rotated in the pool breast high, after the fashion of the nymphs in Götterdämmerung. But because two of the gentlemen were young in years and the third young in spirit, for some reason or other a change came over them, and they forgot Italy and botany and fate. They began to play. Mr. Beebe and Freddie splashed each other. A little deferentially, they splashed George. He was quiet. They feared they had offended him. Then all the forces of youth burst out. He smiled, flung himself at them, splashed them, ducked them, kicked them, muddied them, and drove them out of the pool.
Kicked.
Race you round it then.
Cried Freddie, and they raced in the sunshine. And George took a shortcut and dirtied his shins, and had to bathe a second time. Then Mr. Beebe consented to run, a memorable sight. They ran to get dry, they bathed to get cool, they played at being Indians in the willow herbs and in the bracken, they bathed to get clean. And all the time 3 little bundles lay discreetly on the sward, proclaiming,
No, we are what matters. Without us shall no enterprise begin. To us shall all flesh turn in the end.
A try,
yelled Freddie, snatching up George's bundle and placing it beside an imaginary goalpost.
Soccer rules.
George retorted, scattering Freddie's bundle with a kick.
Goal!
Goal.
Pass!
Take care, my watch.
Cried Mr. Beebe. Clothes flew in all directions.
Take care, my hat. No, that's enough, Freddie. Dress now. No, I say.
But the 2 young men were delirious. Away they twinkled into the trees, Freddie with a clerical waistcoat under his arm, George with a wide-awake hat on his dripping hair.
That'll do,
shouted Mr. Beebe, remembering that after all he was in his own parish. Then his voice changed as if every pine tree was a rural dean.
Steady on. I see people coming, you fellas.
Yells, and widening circles over the dappled earth.
Aye, ladies.
Neither George nor Freddie was truly refined. Still, they did not hear Mr. Beebe's last warning, or they would have avoided Mrs. Honeychurch, Cecil, and Lucy, who were walking down to call on old Mrs. Butterworth. Freddie dropped the waistcoat at their feet and dashed into some bracken. George whooped in their faces, turned, and scudded away down the path to the pond, still clad in Mr. Beebe's hat.
Gracious alive!
Cried Mrs. Honeychurch.
Whoever were those unfortunate people? Oh, dears, look away. And poor Mr. Beebe, too. Whatever has happened?
Come this way immediately.
Commanded Cecil, who always felt that he must lead women, though knew not whither, and protect them, though he knew not against what. He led them now towards the bracken where Freddie sat concealed.
Oh, poor Mr. Beebe. Was that his waistcoat we left in the path? Cecil, Mr. Beebe's waistcoat.
No business of ours,
said Cecil, glancing at Lucy, who was all parasol and evidently minded.
I fancy Mr. Beebe jumped back into the pond.
This way, please. Mrs. Honeychurch, this way.
They followed him up the bank, attempting the tense yet nonchalant expression that is suitable for ladies on such occasions.
Well, I can't help it,
said a voice close ahead, and Freddie reared a freckled face and a pair of snowy shoulders out of the fronds.
I can't be trodden on, can I?
Good gracious me, dear. So it's you. What miserable management. Why not have a comfortable bath at home? with hot and cold laid on.
Look here, Mother, a fellow must wash, and the fellow's got to dry. And if another fellow...
Dear, no doubt you're right as usual, but you are in no position to argue. Come, Lucy.
They turned.
Oh, look, don't look. Oh, poor Mr. Beebe. How unfortunate again.
For Mr. Beebe was just crawling out of the pond, on whose surface garments of an intimate nature did float, while George, the world-weary George, shouted to Freddie that he had hooked a fish.
And me, I've swallowed one.
Answered he of the bracken.
I've swallowed a pollywog. It wriggles in my tummy. I shall die. Emerson, you beast, you've got on my bags.
Hush, dears,
said Mrs. Honeychurch, who found it impossible to remain shocked.
And do be sure you dry yourselves thoroughly first. All these colds come of not drying thoroughly.
Mother, do come away, said Lucy. Oh, for goodness sake, do come.
Hello!
Cried George, so that again the ladies stopped. He regarded himself as dressed. Barefoot, bare-chested, radiant and personable against the shadowy woods, he called,
Hello, Miss Honeychurch. Hello!
Bow, Lucy. Better bow, whoever it is. I shall bow.
Miss Honeychurch bowed. That evening and all that night the water ran away. On the morrow the pool had shrunk to its old size and lost its glory. It had been a call to the blood and to the relaxed will, a passing benediction whose influence did not pass, a holiness, a spell, a momentary chalice for youth.
Hi, Kayla. I don't know when you came on. Thanks for joining. I'm glad you're here. I've been painting away. Did your daughter have softball again today? Oh, I volunteered at a canoe race today, and then I did a little bit of work. I had an opportunity for some overtime, and then I came home, and I think I'm going to have dinner and pack some orders. So thanks for coming. I'm gonna get off kind of quick. I don't know how long you were here. I'm glad you're here, but all right, have a good night. Oh, thanks. You too, Kayla. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.